So, hello, welcome to another episode of Flying High with Flutter. I'm your host, Alan Wyma, and today we have two guests at the same time in two different places, so we get to use some fancy looking transitions. So, we have Laura Browne and her co author, Barbara Limmer. The book is called Interview Speak, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's an interesting book. The name of the book is definitely interesting. Obviously, the interview part makes sense. The speak part, as I start reading through the book, it makes more sense because it's a lot of it is about speaking. It's not about your skills, right? What I like to do is to kind of talk about your background. Who are you? Why are you an authority? Why should we listen to you? And kind of talk your way up to what is it that you're here for?
Now, how about I start off and then
Sure.
we'll have Barbara tell it. Okay. So, hi, I'm Laura Browne, and I was Senior Director of Human Resources for a global tech company for many years. And I taught managers how to be better interviewers. So I know sort of from that side of the desk. Now I'm a speaker, I'm a trainer, I'm a coach. I coach global leaders as well as individuals to be more successful. I have a company, Career Coffee Break, and I show people how to get promoted, how to make more money at work by negotiating raises and higher salaries. And I've written a couple of other business books and a couple of fiction books. Business books including Help My Company Swipe Left, which unfortunately a lot of people are dealing with now. They're losing jobs or they're afraid of losing jobs, which is one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, and a book on increasing your income. I've also written for Forbes. I've been quoted as a business expert in Cosmopolitan Magazine, Family Circle, USA Weekend. Again, I do a lot of training and a lot of coaching of people to help them be more successful in their careers. And that's what brought me to this book. So, Barbara, how about you?
Well, I've had a couple of different careers. My first career was in human resources, and I was always involved in recruiting and interviewing people, as well as referring them to hiring managers, hearing feedback. So for a number of years, I knew what worked and what didn't work in interviewing. And then I switched over to the career coaching side, where I worked first with MBA students at an international business school. I also worked with MBA alumni. I did a lot of mock interviews. And then after about 8 years doing that, I switched over to the private career consulting side, where I worked with managers and executives in all different job functions, all different industries. And again, throughout, I was doing mock interviews and giving specific feedback on what worked and what didn't work. And what I found was a lot of times people would not really answer the question that I was asking. They were not giving me the information I was looking for. And when I told them, here's what the real question was, it was like a light bulb would go off and they'd say, now that I know that, here's how I would answer that question. And they do much, much better. So for a number of years, I thought, there needs to be like a translation book so that people know what is the real question behind each interview question. And that's how the book was born.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I want to add to that. So, Barbara and I have known each other for many, many years. We were actually in a mom's group together that Barbara started. And so, through the years when we had meetings and stuff, we would be talking about this. We'd be talking about what we were doing. We'd be talking about some of the really bad interviews that we were involved in. And we started saying, I really think people would benefit from this. We really should talk about writing this book. And finally, we wrote the book. And as Barbara said, we actually started off with the title, because you were asking about the title. We started off with the title, Translating Interview Speak, because the idea like text speak, interview speak, the things you say. And then we adjusted that to what it is now, interview speak, what your interviewer really wants to know. Because again, we really want to help people to understand, like behind the scenes, what the interviewers are really asking, what the managers really want to know, so you can answer it the best way possible.
How did the conversation go into having this common group that you're in to saying, okay, let's write this book together? I mean, obviously there's lots of steps in between, no?
Well, actually, I kept bugging Barbara about it. So I've written, a bunch of books, a bunch of business books, and I really thought that this was something, because we had been talking about it and we saw it was an issue that would be really good. And I knew that she was an expert in this. I mean, I've had experience, but I mean, Barbara has interviewed so many people in so many situations. So I kept saying, Barbara, we should write a book together. And, and then the next month I'd say, Barbara, we should write a book together. And so I think I finally wore her down. And I gave up a little bit, and then she came back to me and said, Laura, I think we should write a book together. And I said, yes.
Let's do it.
It finally worked. Let's do it.
And let's do it together, because Laura had experience writing books and I did not. So it's been an incredibly great partnership.
It's been really fun. And I love partnering with other people to write books. So Barbara's, I think, the third person I've written books with. And so to me, it's really, really fun because you get the back and forth, you get somebody to question what you've written, you get different ideas. So so we're super happy with the book.
Now,
was this your first book that you wrote together, or was this?
Oh yeah, this is the first book that we wrote together. But this is actually my 12th book. So I've written, as I said.
And this is my first.
Yeah,
this is my first book.
Yeah.
Why choose this topic, though? Out of all the different topics you could choose, there's a big plethora of information, and I think there must be probably a lot of overlap. So why this one?
Well, first of all, let me start off, and then So one of the other books I wrote was called "Help! My Company Swiped Left," and again, I wrote it a couple of years ago with somebody else. I know, another co-author, and it was all about what happens when you get laid off. Because I've been laid off a couple of times, and I know how miserable it is when you get laid off and you beat yourself up. And what do you do? So we wrote that book, and we wrote it, I think, 3 years ago when we were starting to see a lot of people lose jobs. And so we got some really good feedback about that. But we didn't talk about how do you interview for the next job. We talked about you should think about how to get your next job, and here's how to get back on track. But we really didn't answer that. And so I kept thinking there is a big gap. And I knew that Barbara had just such wonderful information and such great background. So Barbara, what would you say?
Well, again, this has been an idea for a very long time of mine. It's a topic I'm passionate about. Again, I've done a lot of both real and mock interviews, and I've experienced firsthand the dialogue that doesn't ever happen in real interviews. And that dialogue is discussing feedback. Here's what you did well in your answer. Here's what could have been better. And I've seen those light bulbs happen over and over and over, where the candidate would say, if only I had known that was really what you were looking for, then I would have answered it this way. So again, I've just been passionate about it for so long. And by the way, I've read a lot of those interview books. And I think, Alan, you were saying a lot of the way we tell people how to answer questions are different than what you've heard. I know there's a lot of, I'm just going to say it, BS out there. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of books. By the way, I read all those books when I was conducting real interviews. So sometimes I would hear one of those answers and I would say, yeah, I read that book too. Give me your real answer. Again, in the experience in interviewing and then coaching people before, during, and after interviews, I realized that most people walk away from interviews thinking they did well because their answer sounded good to them. And then they are absolutely shocked when they don't get the job or they don't get invited back for for another round. And I think it's because they don't really understand what the interviewer is looking for when they ask these questions. So what we do in this book is we take that experience we bring from all sides of the desk, human resources, career coaching. I actually did a stint as a headhunter. And we put the information out there saying, here's the question, here's the translation of that question, and then here's how to answer it. Because we think that if people have that information, they're not giving the canned and the rehearsed and the scripted answers that those other books say. They're better able to develop authentic answers and be real in the interview, and they're going to be much more successful.
Yeah, and actually one of the ways we do that, because to me it's one thing you read, do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that, is we use examples. And so we have some characters in our book, and we have Ari the engineer or somebody in marketing. And so we give them a question and then they give an answer. Now all the answers are good, but we say, here's what's good about the answer. And then after we dissect it, then we say, here are a couple of small changes they could have made to make it great. So maybe they, answered it well, but they didn't talk about the return on investment at the end. Or they did, if they had said, we had a 30% increase in sales after this, that would have nailed the answer. So by reading these examples of what real people might say in an interview, then people get some really good ideas. Okay, this is how I could use it. So we're really excited about the examples we put in.
Yeah, definitely some of these examples I've seen, and they're the way you phrase them is definitely different than I've seen, but it's still the same kind of meaning, right? I've been in the industry for some time. Like you said, or what you kind of hinted before is about like, okay, skills will only get you so far, but then you really have to start to seal the deal with being able to answer questions and being able to communicate things. And once you reach a certain level, it's no longer, okay, can this guy do the job? It's more like, is this the right person? Do they mesh well, right?
Mhm.
Because companies don't really care after a certain level, like, can this person do the work? It's, are they going to disrupt things here in a negative way, right?
Mhm.
Right.
And some of the questions that they ask is really kind of tricky because, how do I say? I mean, people want to be honest, but sometimes you can't be too honest, right? So, for
Yes.
instance, I had a couple of previous employers that were strange, is one way to say it. So, for instance, I said I worked in a real startup, and they would say, what kind of startup is that? And I say, well, I'm working at the boss's kitchen table, dining room table, whatever you want to call it. And
Mhm.
him and his girlfriend would share a blanket, and I presume they were unclothed, and they would shimmy together to the shower, which was just like across the room of where I'm working. And I said, I think I worked in a real startup. I'm not sure about you people, right? If you've ever worked in a real startup or not. I don't mean you in particular, but to the interviewer, right? Which it in hindsight, maybe that's not the best thing because it does kind of come up as a negative thing to a certain extent. But at the same time, it's also something that's interesting to share. So it's kind of like, should I be so honest and open about this? Maybe
Well,
not. I don't know. It's tough
well,
because
and one of the benefits I think of this book is when people are talking about themselves, they're interpreting, like, okay, well, why do you want this job? Well, because I want this and that and the other. Well, in reality, the employer is interpreting what you're saying through their lens, not yours. And so sort of the main theme in this book is to educate people on what the interviewer's lens is. So even though something might sound good to you, we're sharing with you, here's how that gets interpreted. And the
Mhm.
beauty in those examples is you get to read for yourself, here's what this person did really well and why. Why was that so effective? And here's what they could have done to make it even better.
Mhm.
So it it shows people how their answers are being interpreted, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I want to, Alan, I want to go back to something you said because I love it because we hear this so often. I want to be honest because we always say you need to be honest in interviews.
Yep.
However, you don't need to overshare. And so,
Right.
you don't need. And so, for example, if I were interviewing you and you said that, it was a startup, great. I hear that very well. If you told me that story, which I hope you would not, um, I would I would be a little put off by that. So again, is it a true story? Yes. Is it a story that is going to help you get this job? I'm pretty sure no. And so we have to make our own choices about what we share and what we don't share. And I also want to go back to something else you said, which was you hit it on the head. I mean, if you've been in the industry for a while, you got the skills. Okay, that's not a question. And a lot of times people focus on answerings about the skills. But that's only
Right.
one thing that the interviewers want. They want three things. They want to know you got the tech skills, you can do the job. But second, they want to know that you want to do the job, you will be doing the job. Do you have the motivation? And that's why they ask you questions like, what did you like about your last job? Or what do you like about your current job? Or why did you leave your last job? Because they want to know that even though you say, yeah, I want to do this, are you really going to be motivated every day to do this job? So there's a lot of tricky questions asking about motivation. And then the third thing, and you sort of hit on it, Alan, the third thing is will you fit in this job and in this company? So if you can have the skills and you can be motivated, but if you're going to mess things up, like you said, then we don't want you. If you're going to be the kind of person that maybe is not a team player, and we're all team players, but you want to stick out, we don't want you. And so those are the kinds of questions that they ask you, things like, give me an example of how you solved a problem. Give me an example of how you made decisions. And they're looking for, again, if they're a team culture, they're looking for, when you describe a decision, who did you involve? They're looking for, give me an example of how you dealt with a conflict that was very difficult. So again, they want to know you're going to fit. And the other thing, and we don't really go into that this much, but interviewers are fearful. They're afraid if they move you on to another interview and you're a bad match, that their boss is going to say, why did you move this person on?
Yeah.
They were terrible. So they want you to convince them you are a good fit, which is why you'll be moved on. So we cover all of those things.
And the other thing that's really important is to connect with the interviewer on a human level. It is much better to make this sound like a natural back and forth conversation as opposed to a stilted Q&A. So establishing rapport, which by the way, we talk about in the interview, again, if you are in the book, you're being authentic, how do you open the interview to start off building that rapport and relationship? Because you know what? An interviewer who likes you will move you on to the next round, even if you only have 75% of the skills. Somebody else who has 100 or even 110% of the needed skills and qualifications, if they don't come across as likable, if they don't give the interviewer a reason to like them, they're going to find an excuse to not hire you. And that's when you hear things like, oh, we just didn't think you were a fit.
The way we suggest this, and I know early on in my career I didn't want to do this, that go on to LinkedIn, find out, look at the name of the interviewer, find out that they, you both lived in Pennsylvania, find out you both went to the same school, find out something. So we say, so you can start off, hey, I noticed that you live in San Francisco. I lived in San Francisco. And just that moment that makes a connection. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to stalk them online and find out everything about them, but just find out some basic things so you can make that comment and make that connection.
But how you bring it up is also kind of tricky too. Like you said, oh, I see you went to the school.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'd feel a little bit freaked out. Like, wait, huh? What do you know about me? It's a little bit scary, right?
But LinkedIn makes that very easy now, though, because you can say, oh, I noticed on your LinkedIn profile you went to this school.
Mm-hmm.
Or even just on video interviews or in-person interviews, you can comment on a photo. You can make a comment about their background. It's just really important to have that human connection. I think people often forget that. They think, okay, I'm a job candidate. You're the almighty interviewer. No, it's two humans having a conversation.
Yeah. So would you want to, since you are there to, have this interviewer like you, does it make sense to say, I don't know how to, another way to say it's like butter them up, start complimenting them. Oh, you look very nice. This kind of stuff. Or is that maybe too much?
Yeah. Everything in reason. And it's got to be real. Come on. People can tell. If you're just trying to BS them, it's going to be obvious. But you can say, I noticed that background or that photo on your wall, or I noticed on LinkedIn you did this. That was really great. I also did that. So everything within reason.
Yeah, it depends on how you say it. So if somebody got on with me and said, "Oh, I love your jacket and I love your microphone," and I'd be like, "Ew, they're buttering me up." So if it's like more than one thing, I'm gonna feel ick. If it's simply like, "Oh, is that a picture of something?" Or, "Oh, I really like the poster." I don't have one behind you. I really like the poster behind you. That's a simple one. It's not personal. It's just making a comment. So if you can make a comment, then I would say yes. But if you then get to the second one, and I love your hair and your makeup or whatever, then it's icky. So, and all this, by the way, one of the things we talk about is you prepare. So if you're not comfortable with that, you don't have to do it. But maybe in your preparation, maybe you think, what are a couple of things I could say? And you actually practice saying it out loud, so that you see, can I say it in a way that sounds genuine, or am I going to go, your desk looks good, and it's going to be uncomfortable. So that's part of practice. And you can practice like on Zoom. I've recorded myself on Zoom or on something else, or recorded myself on my phone to see, how do I sound when I say things like that? Does it sound genuine? Do I sound like a person that they would want to work with? Because again, the whole point is, will the interviewer like me and think that I am good enough to fit into the culture and the people they are working with? And if so, they will move me ahead. So these are the things you have to think about.
I want to go back to the what we talked about before about, if I bring this person in, are they going to change things around?
Mm-hmm.
What if they're actually looking for that, but you don't know? That is a tricky bit, because there's quite a few companies, there's quite a few interviewers. I think more because I'm based in Hong Kong, so obviously we have this more Asian mindset in some places. A lot of Western people do have this idea, like, actually we need a change, we need some fresh mind, and even with like DEI, like, oh, we need new thoughts, new types of backgrounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So, do you know, like, is there a way that I would be able to find out? Should I not? How do I say this? Because when you interview, right, you don't want to be the loud person for somebody who likes quiet, even though you can be
Right.
both types of people, right? How can you figure out what would be the best way to show which side of yourself to that person? I feel like this sounds so fake, but I think you know what I mean.
No,
Because you could be
no,
both
it does.
quiet and
And
loud, right? Not everybody is like crazy all the time. Sometimes we're also, quiet and conservative, right?
Well, I think so. I'm hearing two things. Number one, about change, right? That's common, where we need someone to come in because we need changes made. It's not about the actual change, it's about how you implement changes. How do you get buy-in? How do you make people feel like this change will benefit them? So a lot of times those questions are not about the specific change you implemented, more so how you got it done and how did you gain acceptance for that change. Secondly, you mentioned, so how can you find this stuff out? Well, part of the preparation can include talking to people who work there now. Reach out on LinkedIn. Again, people are so fortunate to have access to LinkedIn now, because you can connect with people who currently work there and find out how things get done. How do people interact with each other? Because as you get that information, you can incorporate that into your answers so that you're portraying yourself as someone who will fit into their organization.
And if I could add to that, so again, one of the things we talk about is preparation. So obviously you're going to go on the company's website, you're going to see if on the website or if in the things you read about them, they talk about change, then you should expect, okay, there's going to be change, or they're going to want change. The other thing you're going to do is you're really going to pay attention to the question. So for example, if the question, you get a couple of questions about, tell me about a time when you had to deal with really difficult customers. And then the next question is, tell me about a time when when dealing with a difficult customer didn't go well. You're like, okay, I got two questions about difficult customers. I'm going to have to deal with difficult customers. The same way, if you get one or two questions about change, that gives you the idea, okay, change is important to them, because they ask questions about what's important to them. The other thing you asked, which was really interesting. Again, we think you need to connect with the interviewer. And you asked, like, how do I know? Should I be bold? Should I be quiet? And I actually wrote another book about that. My book is called Why Can't You Communicate Like Me? And the idea, just real quick, is that there are 4 communication styles. And what you're going to try to do is match the other person. So if the person gets on and the person is sort of like this and smiling like me and says, hey, how you doing? We're excited to have you here. Then get a little more enthusiastic. If you get on and the person says, hello, my name is Joan, I am here to interview you, then you need to bring it down a little bit. Not to say that you need to change, but if you have an interviewer that's excited, then you should smile. If you have an interviewer that's quieter and takes a little longer, then you can match that just a little bit, maybe slow down a little. So does that help?
Yes, and I just bought your book right now. I'm interested. You sold me, so I'm interested to know more about this. Yeah.
Well, in that book, I actually have a test, a communication test in there to tell you what is your style. But it's also, you can look on there, it's DISC, DISC. I mean, that's a big one that basically people are either emotional, like focus on emotions, or not so emotional. And people are either, you know, are either like enthusiastic or they're quieter, and they're either fast paced or they're steadier. And if you can figure out a little bit about the other person, again, you can either slow down, speed up, be more enthusiastic, or be a little quieter. Anyway, Barbara, what were you going to say?
And that builds likability too,
Yes.
just by doing that. The other thing I was going to say, going back to the interview, yes, you're paying attention to the questions you're being asked, of course, but even before the interview, we mentioned how critical preparation is. And one of the things we do in the book is show you what we call how to deconstruct a job description.
Mhm.
So when you apply to a job online or you hear about a job, you get the job posting, you can go through that like a fine-tooth comb and read, okay, here's what they're telling me, not just under the qualification section, but here's what they need me to do in this job. Every bullet point on there could be an interview question. So we show you how to, again, translate. Here's what it says in the job description. Here's how that might show up as an interview question so that you can prepare your answers and have examples ready. The other thing I used to hear all the time in the mock interviews is, I'll ask a question and they would say, well, the first example that comes to mind is this. And my heart would sink a little because guess what? The first example that comes to mind is not always the best example. So if you've prepared, you know in advance, if they ask me about this topic, here's my best example to share. And the more prepared you are, not only is it more likely you're going to succeed in the interview, but it actually makes it easier, takes some of the stress out. You've got this. And then in the heat of the moment, you're just having a conversation. What they ask me about, I'm either going to have an example ready or I'm going to stop and think what example from my past best fits this question.
Approximately after you've interviewed a few times, you start to have an idea because the questions they sometimes like you keep coming back. Tell me about your weaknesses, your strengths, etc. How much preparation should you do? Because sometimes you prepare too much and you start reciting a script, right? I'm sure you've
Yeah,
had these kinds of interviews before. So, do you have any
we
kinds of
we talk about
recommendations?
that.
Yeah, how many? Like, how can I make sure that I don't have this kind of that I don't become Marco Rubio? I believe he was the one that would read off something. If you guys remember that.
Well,
We
so
actually we actually do not provide scripts for that very reason. And by the way, I've only in all of the thousands of people I've interviewed, I have only ever had one person be successful in giving a memorized answer. I later found out, guess what? He has a theater background. He's an actor. So, of course, he can say something that's memorized and make it sound real. Most people cannot. And yes, there is such a thing as over preparation. And you just have to kind of know that about yourself that I've prepared. It's like going into a test. And now in the moment, I'm going to use my ability to listen and think. And if they ask me a crazy question like, if you were a superhero, what would your special power be? It's okay to say, wow, let me think about that. Whereas if they ask you, why are you interested in this job? It's not okay to say, let me think about that. So certain questions you've got to be ready for.
and
Laura?
it's interesting, yeah, because we have a chapter on here are common questions. You must know the answer to all of these because if the interviewer asks again, why do you want this job, and you pause and say, I never thought about it, then I mean, forget it. You're done. So you have to have the answer. But Alan, I think you also pointed out you don't want to have a memorized answer. So preparation is, so let's say, I'm answering the, why do you want this job? And obviously the right answer is not, well, because I need a paycheck. It's
Yeah.
the answer is all about what I am going to do for the company and how I can help the team. And so you need to jot this down. And so typically, what I recommend is have some bullet points and have a story so you remember. So it's not a script that I will now read So the reason I want this job is this, but have the bullet points. But then having said that, then I also again recommend that you practice it. And whether you get a friend of yours to say, okay, do a mock interview. Here are some questions that you might ask me, and ask any of that you want, and practice actually doing it. So not so you say exactly the right words, but so you get the message out. Because really what the interviewer wants is not perfect sentences, because they'll find that weird if, again, it looks like it's a script, but they want the main ideas. And the other thing I want to mention again, and we sort of hit on it a little bit, that if you have like these scripted answers, which we don't want you to have, then what you'll do is make one of the big mistakes we talk about, which is not hearing the whole question. So
Yes.
you'll hear the beginning of a question, which might be, tell me about a time when you had a conflict. And like, boom, it's the conflict question. I'm going to answer it this way. Instead of hearing, tell me about a time when you had a conflict, you had to bring senior leaders in, and your team wasn't sure that this was a right situation. What did you do then? So what's going to happen if you only listen to the first part is you're going to give the wrong answer, which is what we've heard a ton of times. So again, what we always say is listen to the whole question. And it's okay to pause a moment. And actually, if it's a long question, because some interviewers have these really long, convoluted questions, have a piece of paper there. Jot down a little bit about, senior leader or whatever it is that you're trying to put in there. And so when you pause and say, well, let me tell you about a time, you can hit the couple of key things that they said. So those are some things that I really want you to think about, because again, we don't want to give scripted answers. We don't want you to feel like you have to say exactly this. We want you to be authentic. Here are some ideas and here are some suggestions, but you have to pick your own authentic answers that sound authentic when you say it. That's my suggestion.
I believe we lost one of our other guests. I'm going to try to get her back on.
She's going to get back on. We had talked about the fact that we have some stories. So, like we have Ari the engineer, we have somebody in marketing. And one of the things that we got feedback on early on is we needed some negative stories. So what happened, our wonderful publisher, basically about halfway through us rewriting the book, when we started working with this publisher, is they bring in reviewers. And so these reviewers, they're just people like you and me. They review the book. And so they said, we want more examples. So we added more examples. And then they said, we want negative examples, which we hadn't put in. So what we did is we developed a character. His name is Clueless Clark. And Clueless Clark thinks he does a great job all the time. He thinks he's wonderful. He's always thinks he's great, but he never gets a second interview. And so we have interviewed these people and we've heard stories about these people. Now we make the stories a little bit fun. We exaggerate maybe just a little bit, but we ask a question, like, tell me about yourself. And Clueless Clark starts off with, I'm amazing. I'm the best person you will ever find, or something ridiculous. And we talk not only about what he did wrong, but also what he should have done differently. And so you learn from the different part. And what was really interesting is at the end, when we finished the book, before it went online, because it's now available online and it will be in print in a couple of months. But before we did that, we had some other readers read it. And one of the feedback things we got was, first of all, a couple of people said, I interviewed Clueless Clark. And so I have seen this person. And one person said, oh my gosh, I was Clueless Clark until I read this. I thought I shouldn't prepare. I thought I needed to wing it and be myself, and that would be the best thing. And no wonder I'm not getting interviews. But he said, I got a second interview using what was in this book. So again, it's just an emphasis on you have to prepare. Don't just wing it and think you're going to show up and be able to do it, even though it takes a lot of time to do the preparations. We think it's super, super important.
I also was in that boat before, and but yeah, just putting in the legwork definitely helps a lot.
It does. Yeah. And it's not just that it helps for that interview. I mean, obviously, if you get a second interview or third interview, then that really helps. But even just going through the tell me about yourself questions and what are your weakness questions and things like that, you can use that for any job that you're going for. So my feeling is, even though it may take a couple of hours to do this preparation, the time you spend is worth it. First of all, it's worth it if you get this job, but it's also worth it for future interviews. So yeah, so we want to help people to spend that time the best way they can in preparation, so they're really, really ready, and they end up those interviews feeling like, yeah, I did a good job.
I'm actually kind of curious. If you talk about different questions, right? What are some of the hardest questions that you think they typically ask?
Oh yeah, that and so obviously everybody has sort of different ideas about hard questions, but honestly, one of the hardest questions sounds like the simplest, which is tell me about yourself, because a lot of people get sort of get trapped in that they speak too long, or they don't realize what the question is really about. Another question is, what are your strengths and weaknesses? Another is, what are your career goals? People say things like, my goal is to get this job. That's not the right answer. Other questions that trip people up, or the money question. So what kind of salary are you looking for? That a lot of times that trips people up. Also, negative questions like, tell me about a failure. Tell me about a time that you made a mistake. Describe a problem you were unable to solve. Describe a decision you regretted. And those are really hard because, we're in an interview. We don't want to, say I couldn't solve a problem, or I made a mistake. But the fact is, you have to admit that there was a problem that you couldn't solve, because I mean that's life. And so the interviewer wants to know, can you see mistakes and can you change? So if you get stuck on, like, there's never been a problem in my life that I haven't been able to solve, then first of all, they're going to think that you're not real. They're going to think you're lying. And they're also going to think, you know what, in this job, there are problems. And I need somebody that's willing to think differently or pivot or do something. And if you're not that person, you're not going to be in this job. So those are a lot of the hard questions that we handle.
I can tell one of my answers because there's always like an answer, like tell me one time that you failed or something like that. And one of the times that I actually kind of failed or didn't succeed was when I knew that I had a team, and I knew that we needed to eventually have an actual system to track bugs and features and make sure that we're on the
Yeah.
right track. But at the time, everybody wanted to use Excel, which is not a serious feature tracking system, right?
Yeah.
And so I knew where we needed to go, but getting them to go there, I was trying this top-down approach, which at the time I was the product manager, right? So I was kind of leading the project. And so I was trying to push them onto it, and it just kind of blew up in my face. This is over 10 years ago, so I don't remember the exact details, but I remember that it didn't work out well. And what I found out was just, okay, let's keep riding this train and remind them. And then one day it didn't work out well and everybody knew it. And then I was like, hey, do you guys remember? How about we try it this time? And at that point, everybody bought in because they also said, oh, actually, you know what? You're right. This doesn't work long term. Maybe this will. Because I think part of the problem that didn't work before is because I wasn't able to get the actual buy-in from people. Instead of pushing it on to people, it's better to lead them in that direction and to show them this is the right thing. And having this blow up was the way to go. And I think that's it's not maybe not the best story ever, but it's a true one. And it had a positive outcome, right? I knew
Yes.
where we needed to go, but my method for getting them there was wrong. And I found out the right way because of it. So I learned something. So I think that's one that shows people, hey, he doesn't
Yes.
always get it right the first time. He's real, as you said. And he found out what's the right thing to do. And they went that way and they were successful. So in the
Yes.
end, it had a negative, but it ended with a positive, right?
I love that story for a couple of different reasons. I mean, also the things that you said. First of all, you picked a story from 10 years ago. So typically, and it depends. If you can pick a story from a little far back, then you can say, "Oh, I learned." Okay, so you gave that "I learned." Now, here's what I would add to make it even better. I learned, and then after that, this is what I did to start making sure that I involved people early on or whatever. And so in a recent thing, I involved people early on and we were able to, get a, 10% increase right away or something. So if you can say, I learned, here's what I did, and now this is what I do, and you don't have to worry about that anymore, that makes it a really solid answer.
That's a good point. I should write that down. I think I really should keep like an FAQ of these kind of things. It's very useful for these kind of things to always have a story ready or
Yes.
always have some stories ready and kind of choose the one that makes the most sense for the situation.
And that's what we suggest, again, for interviews. Part of the preparation is choose some stories that do this, that do that, so that, again, you're not thinking, what's a story? You should already have a story of when you made a mistake and you figured it out. You should already have a story of, when you made a good decision. Have these stories ready. Now, maybe you'll only use 2 or 3 stories, but maybe you have 10 stories ready so that you can pull them out when you need to. So absolutely, we totally recommend that.
I would like to chat a bit about the old salary question.
One of my favorites.
Yeah, and I mean you're definitely an authoritative person on this one. I might pick up your other book about the salary because that's really a tricky question.
Yes, it is.
What I've found is that one of the best answers to give is basically, or one that I did see recently, and I think it makes sense, and I would love to hear your take on it.
Yeah.
Is they always try to how do I say this? The person who I learned this from, they make it as HR or whoever is in the early part of the process, it's part of their job to try to strain through candidates. And let's say if it's a very popular position, the faster they can start to sort through people who don't make it, easier it is their life is, right?
Yes.
And so that one of the best ways to do that is how much do you want, right? So if we have 1,000 candidates and some are very much cheaper than you, how much do you want? So the question, that one. So what I always try to do is try to my best to kick the can down the road. And so what I usually do is I just say, hey, I really don't know enough about this position. I know that this company's great. I know that it sounds great, but I would love to hear more about your, what are other benefits? Because salary isn't the only thing that's important to me. Some other things also have value too. Like, do you offer this, and start naming things. So I would love to hear more about what you provide as a whole package before I can able to answer this question for you.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them try to get smart and they start throwing things at me. Oh, we have this. I said, that's all great. I need time to think about this because it's not a very simple answer for me.
Yeah.
And
that's a good answer. Yes. So let me build on what you just said, because I want to give it from the interviewer point of view. So you hit the nail on the head that as an interviewer, I don't want to waste my time or the manager's time or whatever with people who are not in the right salary range. And I remember one time I interviewed for a job. It was a good job. And the interviewer, brought up the salary. And actually, she just said, listen, the salary is X. And I said, is there any flexibility there? She said, nope, the salary is X. And I said, thank you very much. That is not, I'm not interested. And it saved her time and me time. Now, that was unusual. That was the only time I've ever interviewed for a job. And the salary was so low. I mean, it wasn't even close. I think I made a comment that I'm a little surprised. But anyway, here's what you do. So I like what you said, which is I need to know more. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. What I typically say is when they say, what's your salary range? This is what I say. I say, what's the salary range for this position? And you would be surprised how many times they actually answer it. I mean, and so most of the time they will say, oh, the salary range is X to Y. And then you say, great, that's what I'm looking for, or that's within my range. That's wonderful. That works for me, because all they want is confirmation that works for you. Now, as I said, it works a bunch of times when you say, what is the salary range? With some people, it doesn't. They'll say, okay, come on, what salary range are you looking for? And then a lot of times I go to what you said, wait to know more about the position. And then sometimes they'll go, seriously, just tell me. So when you get to that point, you're like, okay, now what you have done though is hey, Barbara, what you have done though is you should have gone through and done your homework and found out by going on, and there are a lot of sites that you can go on to find out what is the salary range for this position or a similar position in my area and for this kind of job, like large, tech company, small startup company or whatever. So you should have a range. And so the answer should be, well, the range I am looking for is X to Y, but the range needs to be big. The lowest amount needs to be something that you would actually accept if they gave it to you. But, it should be, my range is between 100 and 150 or something. I mean, make it big. So it should fall in there someplace, but that's only if You ask the question first and say, what is the salary range? And they won't answer, and they really press you on it. So that to me is the final thing, if you have to. But really, everybody try asking them what the salary is, because you would be surprised. So does that help, Alan?
Well, it helps, but I have more to say about this one because like I said, I've been through the motion many times, and I've asked, "Is there a range?" And sometimes, and actually, I've gotten, "No, there's no range. It's a new position. We don't know what the right range is."
Mm-hmm.
I've actually heard employers say, "We don't reveal ranges to candidates."
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes they won't. But there are
But you can
states
also,
in the U.S. now that mandate making the range public.
Yeah. So it's in these certain states. But the other thing you can do, and I forgot to say it, is you can say, from my research, I have seen similar jobs in the range of X to Y. And that is what I'm looking for. So that's not saying I want this. That is saying the research I have done shows this. And so, then again, if the company says, well, it's a new position, we haven't decided a range, you're helping them by saying this is the range. So that's another way. Did you have anything else?
Well, and I don't know if you guys covered this. Sorry that I was out for a few minutes. The point is not to get into a negotiation before you even have the job offer.
Yeah.
So you want to answer the question and move on and make it a non-issue. You've got a wide open range. Here's the research I've been able to do. And, I'm sure when the time comes, you guys will make me a fair offer.
Mm-hmm.
And the implication is, can we please move on to talk about what it is you need in your job and how I can help you? You're not going to say that, but that's really where you want to get the conversation back. You don't want to get hung up in this money talk prematurely. And everything that happens prior to getting the job offer is premature to spend too much time talking about money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because when you get the job offer, that's when you have the leverage, because at that point they want you, and that's when you can negotiate. But yeah, don't negotiate earlier than that, because again, that just takes you off track.
Yeah, that's what I try my best to do. Try to make them want me, and then, like you said, you have the high ground, or like you said, the leverage. That's why I try my best just to kick it down the road. And I always hear the expression, like when it comes to this, whoever says a number first loses. Is that necessarily true, or is that a little bit of a meek look at it?
It's not true all the time. However, it can cause a problem. And again, because if I give, let me give you an example. So, if they say, how much do you want? And I say, I want X. Now, if the number X is really, really low, they're thinking, oh, she doesn't have the experience. She's in the wrong place. And if the number X is really, really high, they're thinking, oh, this person is too much. We can't help them. But if it's, so you need to be more in the middle, and you don't know what that number is. That's why you don't want to give, first of all, a number. And if you have to give a number, it's a range. And so the range will show I'm around this area. Yeah. So if you give a number, it could cause some negative thoughts in the interviewer. So I would be concerned about that.
Well, and the other thing that, people don't know going in, the whole compensation package. I mean, remember the days of startups where, people are making very low base salaries, but they're getting the stock options and they're getting all of these other things. So you might say a salary that is way outside their range, not recognizing all of the other cash compensation you're getting as part of the package. So that saying about he who gives a number first loses, I think that's a little too simplified. But that's why what Laura was saying, first try and get the range out of them. Look, I don't know anything about your budget, your comp range. Would you please share with me what the range is of this position? And often you'll get it. And then great, that sounds good to me. What else would you like to know about my background?
Yeah, good. And then try and get them back to, let's talk about some other questions so I can convince you that I'm the right person for this job.
But if you try to avoid answering it too much, like if they come back, oh, we don't reveal ranges, I need a range from you. The more you push and pull, guess what? That's going to reduce your likability and rapport, and also your likelihood of getting the job. So if they come back and ask again, you've got to have that range ready, as Laura was saying.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's good. So it sounds like we're pretty much in line. Yeah, I'm aware of trying to avoid. It's always a difficult question, right? And it's always so uncomfortable. I'm just kind of curious as a personal note, or a personal kind of question is there a way to change that icky feeling? Because like you want to be likable, but when you're asking for money from somebody, I mean, yes, you're getting compensated, but at the same time, you are asking for a number, and sometimes some of us,
No,
especially me, feels a little bit like, is this okay? I don't know.
you're
Like, I think I'm worth this, but am I? Like you start to kind of question. Is this the right
I'm
thing?
gonna correct that though. I'm going to correct that. You're not asking for a number yet. You're not doing that until you have an offer, and then you come back perhaps with a counter proposal. But during an interview, you're not asking for a number. You're asking for a job. You're selling yourself toward the job. Again, it's all about what do you need in this job and how can I help you with those needs. So I think the best way to avoid that awkward feeling is to be prepared. So, again, in the chapter on commonly asked questions, we talk through all of those that you must be ready for. So, the way you reduce the awkwardness is to be prepared. If they ask me my salary range, here's what I'm going to say. Step one,
Yeah.
try and get the range out of them. Step two, have a range ready.
Yeah. And let me add to that. I get the icky feeling because salary feels a lot more personal than anything else. If I'm asking health benefits or whatever, that doesn't feel personal. Salary feels personal. Salary feels like, am I valuable enough to ask for X? And so people get very weird about thinking about salary. And so what we're trying to do is help them. In one of my books, what I say is one of the rules in my salary book is it's business, it's not personal. So that's why we say part of preparation is look at, what the internet says, what information there is on what the salary range is. So instead of saying, instead of having to say, I think, am I worth X amount of dollars? It's this job, the range for this job is typically this. Do I agree with that? Yeah, that's so again, if you can talk about the range, if you can talk about typical, something like that, then that can help. And again, you may have to do some, thinking on your own beforehand to prepare yourself and not worry about, am I worth X amount of dollars?
Yeah,
The job is X amount of
that's
dollars,
it.
and I can do the job. And I know I can do the job. And so maybe you have to work on your confidence a little bit to think about, I can do the job is this. It's not a question of my value or, am I a good person? It's simply, here is a business thing. They are willing to pay this salary for this job. So sometimes
Well,
thinking like
yeah.
that can help you get past it. Go ahead.
And salaries do not go with people. I'm sorry, they do
Yeah.
not. Salaries
Hmm.
go with jobs. I've had clients in executive roles who say, I want a change in lifestyle. I do not want the stress of managing hundreds of people. I want to go back to being an individual contributor, or I want to be a frontline supervisor. Guess what? You're not going to get the same pay that you did as an executive. You're going to get paid for the job you're being asked to do. So that's what I mean when I say salaries don't go with people, they go with jobs. And that's why,
Hmm.
again, it's important to research what does this job typically pay out there?
Hmm.
Yeah, I often get that question too because I've changed from. I mean, I went from a bank. Sorry, remember I worked at that very slim, slender startup, right? And
Hmm.
then I worked at another position, and uh, I think they understood about the salary matching the job. But when HR got involved, because I talked to the hiring manager, and then HR has to do the paperwork, and they're like, well, "Wait a minute, how come your salary went 3x? It should be a 10% or 15% increase. Why is it 3x?" It's like,
Hmm.
well, you need to understand that it's totally different. I'm going
The
Hmm.
from a
job is
startup.
different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm going from a startup
Yes.
to now an actual like well-established
Hmm.
fintech vendor for banks. It's totally different, and they just could not understand that. So I mean, it's tricky. Like every time I apply for a position, I often ask, "What was your last salary?" And I
Yeah.
also have the same thing as you, saying, "Okay, Listen, if my last position was pizza delivery guy, I mean, you can't really compare the
Yeah.
two. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
You can't.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them really can't get that through their mind, and I don't know how to explain to them
Yeah.
that it doesn't really make sense.
Well, again,
Mm-hmm.
there are some states that have made that, states in the US that have made that question illegal because what you made in the past really is not relevant. What is relevant is this job and what compensation is appropriate for this job.
Yeah. And when you get that question, what have you made in the past, if you're not in one of those states, you can just say, you don't have to answer it directly.
Right.
So you can say, let's talk about, what I think is, the range that I'm looking for here for this job. And then that's when you can ask, can you tell me what the range is? And then
Yeah.
again, you can start this. But my feeling is, unless they push, don't feel that you have to answer that. And then, in my feeling, if I answered that and I was at that weird, startup, I would say, well, the compensation included quite a bit of other things. And as Barbara said, including, I don't know, stock or whatever. However, the financial compensation was this, but make sure that you set the stage. There was all of this other stuff. So you're helping HR, because it's typically HR that's going, no, this does not fit into, our little mold here. I don't understand. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you're trying to help HR, but, you also have to recognize that's going to be an issue, and that's part of preparation that you're ready for. Okay, chances are they're going to ask me this. How can I say it? And again, to me, it's always about practice. How can I respond in a way that sounds positive, likable, maybe curious, instead of, well, how much does this job pay? So even though we're coming up with the answers, again, part of preparation, I record myself or I do it with somebody else, is the way you say it. Again, are you trying to connect with that recruiter so they feel good about you, or are you trying to fight with them? And so you want to make sure it's all about I am a likable person. We could work together. I could make your job easier if you move me up. And so they feel like, yes, I want to move this person up in the job interview process.
You make me feel like I should have said to them, well, they included entertainment into the compensation package.
Yeah, I just wouldn't have explained what the entertainment was.
No, but it's a good joke to yourself, right?
Yes, it is. But the funny part is, if you say that to yourself, then before you answer, you're going to smile. And you're going to come across as more likable instead of coming across as tense and nervous.
Yeah, but then you have this inside joke with only yourself. You can only tell your spouse or whoever knows that. We do have a question from the audience, which actually is another question. I think this is a really great question, and I'm hoping that we can end the salary talk after this one, but this is a really great question. So it's, what if they ask for a number in the application form? Because now they have these forms, right? And you have to put a number there.
Yeah.
Right.
So this one is very tricky. So this is from Charles Steinmetz, by the way.
I don't know. What do you think, Barbara?
Well, so here's my advice. You're right. This is why, whenever possible, you want to avoid just applying to jobs online. That's a whole other topic, and why that usually doesn't work. But you're right. These online forms force you to give a salary. And what I would say is, give the lowest salary you're willing to accept that you feel is appropriate for that job. Now, again, many people might say, wait, but no, then they're going to offer me the low salary. No, the point is, you want to get invited to the interview. Just because you wrote, here's the minimum salary you would consider, doesn't mean you would accept that job. Once you interview and talk about the value you will bring to that job and get to the point of getting the job offer, now you can negotiate. First of all, you've got the leverage, as Laura said earlier. Second of all, you've got a lot more information about the job and what they need and what problems they need you to solve. And you can use that to justify getting a higher salary. But if what you write on that form is too high, you're not even going to be invited to the party.
That's a good answer, because I'm always kind of curious about that, because sometimes they you have to type a number in, like they put in the validations there.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's a good point. I'll have to keep that in mind if I ever need that. Now I have another question, which I don't know if it's covered in your book because I didn't have time to finish the whole thing. What if the interview becomes hostile, right? I've actually had an interview once with, you both look very confused. It's very interesting. So there was a company they were hiring for, so they had this, I don't remember what kind of product it was. It was a bunch of researchers, very, what I would call nerdy guys who knew a lot of very deep level stuff about things that I don't know so deep as them. But what they needed was they needed somebody to build what we call APIs or some kind of way to connect to their system. And that I knew very, very well. And they did not know, right? And I went to the interview, obviously, and he asked me, "Do you know what this thing is? This like data type?" And I said, "No, I never heard of that. How about this one? How about that one?" I said, "No, no, no." And the guy said, "You know nothing." And he didn't say it in like how I said it. He said it much more, drawn out, more mean, more brutal. And I finally got frustrated with him, and I said, "Do you know what these things are? Like for the position, do you know what these things are?" He said, "No, no, no." And I said, "Well, you know nothing. This is why you have to hire me." And it was quite interesting. I mean, I don't recommend that you probably do this at every position, but that was how I solved that one. And actually, it ended up being that they were interested in me because of that. And I feel like for that particular person, because I chatted with other people and said, "This is what happened." I said, "This is kind of weird. Do you have any idea why me yelling back worked out?" And they said, "Actually, this is what they said. They said actually that researchers actually talk like this to each other, and you get respect when you start to yell back at each other." And I said, "Okay, strange." But
so
I think
the answer is, you proved that you could fit their environment.
Yeah, apparently,
that's what they were looking for.
But still, I mean, there is times when you do get into a hostile interview, right? It's happened. I mean, hopefully you haven't done the hostile part, but you may have been in those situations. And how should we react? Should we just walk out of the room? Should we say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm no longer interested"? What would be kind of the way that we should handle this kind of situation?
Well, I think first we need to let's look at why you might have these interviews. Some people actually choose to do this, like, and he might not have been choosing to, but they choose to do it because they know, let's say, you're going to be coming to a hostile environment, and so they're hostile in the interview because they want to test you a little bit. Okay, so that's the first reason. And actually, we have a story in there that we know somebody that was in an interview like that. The person was hostile and she got offered the job, but she decided that she didn't want it because if the team was going to be so hostile, why would you want to do that? So that's one reason. Another reason might be that the person really doesn't know, that maybe the person is a negative person, or the person is mad, or the person's afraid you're going to take their job away from them, or whatever. And so one of the things I want you to think about with that is it one person or is it a lot of people? So there are going to be times that you're interviewing with peers, that you're interviewing with the employees, you're interviewing with the boss's boss, and one of them might be a jerk. But if the rest of them are okay, then take that to consideration. And so most of the time, if the person is a jerk, you're going to have to pause and you're going to have to think. And my personal feeling is I would not react. I would not, yell at the other person or anything like that. But I would do more of the pausing and then be curious, help me understand what's going on here. Why are you asking about these questions? My understanding was that these were the things that were needed. Perhaps I'm wrong. And just see. On the other hand, if it's really hostile, I might just, and you know what? It sounds like it's just not a good fit. I mean, if you really don't want the job. But I would be careful about that. So what would you say, Barbara?
One of the things that I think is really important to consider is, to what extent will you be interacting with that person in this job? If they're your boss and you're just not clicking with them, that's going to have a big impact on how happy you are in that job. If they're an HR person, I've heard this a lot actually, where the first screener is a junior HR talent acquisition person who is reading from a script or interrupting or just is not a very good interviewer. And the candidate is like, forget it. If they're like that, I don't want to work for them. Well, wait a minute. once you get hired, are you ever going to speak to that talent acquisition person again? Just, write that off and keep going until you get to meet the people you're actually going to be working with. And by the way, we have a chapter in the book on how to deal with bad interviewers and really good interviewers, because they both can be a challenge. And anyway, I would say usually when you're dealing with someone that's being hostile or forcing you to interact in a stressful situation, it could be because that's just their personality, or it could be because they're testing you to see how are you going to react. You might be dealing with hostile customers or clients, and you've got to show that you can stay calm and maintain your balance in that kind of situation.
I finally found the section you're talking about, and I was just thinking about one of the interviewer types you talked about was the one that talks a lot. I remember, I think I did have an interview that talked almost the entire time, and then they came out and said, "This guy's great," and I was like,
Yes.
and then I talked to the next person, and they're like, "Oh, we heard that you were really great," and I said, "I don't think I said very much to this person."
But you showed what a great listener you are.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was just such a weird situation, right? But I think I started trying to get more of that kind of style as life went on, because I read the book about from Dale Carnegie about how to win friends and influence people,
Influence
and
people.
then that helps a lot. So at the same time, I don't know. It's always good to make sure people, like you. It can only help you in terms of getting forward, right?
It can. And the other thing is, but again, in that era, we talk about there are different stages. So sometimes interviewers are only there just to say, yeah, this person's okay. So they may not have any questions. They may think, I'm looked at this, this person's resume. I've talked to other people. I know I'm going to hire this person. So unless you come across bad, you know, it's going to be a yes. So when you have those really talkative people, they might already have decided, or maybe they're just a really talkative person and they're lousy interviewers. You never know. But again, it gets back to likability. And when you can, and they pause because they have to breathe at some point, you can say, that reminds me of a time, at this job when I did something like that. And so you can, drop in a couple of key things that you have planned to say, even if they're not asking you questions, so they can leave thinking, oh yeah, that person had some good examples. So again, you never know who you're going to get. You have to be prepared for all different kinds of interviewers.
Yeah, that's a good point. You at least should drop in a couple of points.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important before every interview, again, part of preparation, knowing what are your key selling points? What do you want to make sure they know about you before you leave? So even if they don't ask you a question on that, at the end, they very often will say, is there anything else about you want me to know? And that's when you can say, yes, one of the things we didn't get to talk about is this project I worked on that is very relevant to what you're doing here. So if you know those things, you can be looking for opportunities to share those aspects of your background so that you don't walk away going, man, I didn't get to tell them about this. They could also say, so what questions do you have?
Yeah.
And again, you're given the floor. And you could say, I do have some questions, but before I ask you those, there's one thing we didn't get to talk about, and I want to make sure you know this. So again, anytime you're given the floor, if you know in your mind, I want to make sure I get through these aspects of my background, even if they don't ask me, you've got an opportunity to talk about it, assuming it's relevant to the job.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Charles did say thank you, just so we make sure we put that on there.
You're welcome.
Welcome.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah. There was more questions that came to my mind, but I think we've gone over time quite a bit, but there's definitely a lot of juicy information here. I do appreciate kind of getting your advice as being on both sides, right? I mean, you actually had to interview to get the job, and then you also had to do interviews when you were at the job. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been a long day. Yeah, I mean, so now I'm going to do the interviewer side and say, is there anything else that you wanted the listeners to hear?
I think it's very, very important to make sure you're prepared for every interview and be authentic in your answers, be real. If you have stories prepared or examples that tie to the job you're interviewing for, you'll have them at top of mind.
Mhm.
If that question gets asked, you're less likely to leave saying, shoot, I wish I had used this example instead of that one.
Mhm.
And again, part of our book is showing how best to prepare.
Yeah, and I would absolutely emphasize that. I mean, I put like I think prepare, prepare, prepare. If that's what you remember from today, just do the preparation. It will mean less stress, more chances to get the job, and our book can help you to do that. We already mentioned, but I just want to be clear, it's available online right now, and it's going to be paperback in the summertime. And as listeners of podcasts, you can get a really special discount, 45% off. So we're super excited about that because we want to make it easier for you to get your next job. And I just want to thank you, Alan, for having us on and giving us a chance to share this information because we really want to help as many people as possible. So thank you.
Yes,
Actually,
thank you, Alan.
I do have one last question.
What?
Because Manning is basically, my understanding is they mostly focus on tech-focused books. But if I remember correctly, when I was reading through the book, I believe you first said that this book is not actually made for tech people. It's more so made for business.
Everybody.
Well, of course, everybody,
Everybody.
but I thought I specifically saw business or something. But yeah,
Well,
everybody.
yeah.
So why
And so
pick
what's your
Manning as a
question?
publisher? Yeah, that's. I mean, why publish on Manning, right? It seems like such a because it's not tech focused, right? We do have quite a few tech focused hiring or looking for job kind of review books on Manning, but this one is really not anything to tech with at all, I would say.
But their audience needs this information. So I think that's why they wanted to offer this information. It's applicable to a wider audience, people in all sorts of job functions and industries. However, tech people often are really good at answering about the technology and the work they do, but they don't necessarily know how to answer those other questions like how do you solve problems? What kind of salary are you looking for? What are your strengths and weaknesses? So they need this information. And that's why Manning wanted to offer our book.
And the reason we went to them is we knew somebody that had worked with Manning and had
Uh,
great things to say. And so we heard really good things, sort of like in an interview, you hear good things from somebody else.
Yeah.
And so we contacted Manning and we started talking to them, and they said they wanted to expand. And so this was
Yep.
the right book at the right time.
okay, now it
It
makes
was
sense.
actually a client of mine that referred us, the tech CEO. So he referred us to Manning, and the rest is history, as they say.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward because I think there's a lot of really good information here. So I'll have to finish where I left off at. Thank you both for coming on. Yeah, as they said, we do have a 45% discount. So we'll put that into the show notes of the podcast and the YouTube video. And yeah, again, thanks for coming on.
Well, we have enjoyed this today. So thank you so much, Alan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.